Welcome to Keeping It Green, a podcast for ornamental plant professionals and enthusiasts, with hosts Margaret Pickoff and Tom Butzler.
Hello and welcome to Keeping It Green, a podcast from Penn State Extension for ornamental plant professionals and enthusiasts. I'm one of your hosts, Margaret Pickoff. I'm a horticulture educator with Penn State Extension, and on each episode, I'll be joined by one of my colleagues on the green industry team as a co-host. On today's episode, my co-host is Tom Butzler. Hello, Tom.
How you doing, Margaret?
I'm doing pretty well. How are you?
Yeah, good. We've had some great weather here the past couple of days. So that's always nice.
We have. I was just saying that I'm feeling my spring allergy is starting to to perk up, and it's only mid-February, so
It's going to be a long season then, right?
Lots of fun stuff in store. So before, on today's episode, we'll be joined by Dr. Rick Bates from Penn State University. But before we get to our interview with Rick, we'll start out with a quick check-in about what we, your hosts, are seeing or thinking about in the field at this time of year, what we're planning. So Tom, what are you working on currently? Or what are you seeing?
We're heading down the stretch with the winter meetings, so those are finishing up, and shortly having a pesticide applicator short course coming up. So that'll be a week-long training for those applicators or the future applicators, just to go through the process and get ready for the exam. But you did mention this idea of what are you thinking about, and you mentioned that warm weather. And so here's a question I have, Margaret, when I was out in some of this almost 70-degree weather.
Yeah.
Could this be beneficial in the sense that some of these insects that are detrimental to plant life, such as the spongy moth, could they be advancing in their life stage, because they have to soak up those heat units to go to the next life stage? Could they be tricked almost into getting ahead of where they really should be, and then we get this cold weather that would come in and kind of slam them and interrupt that life cycle, or maybe hit them when they're really vulnerable? So that 70-degree weather for a couple of days, I mean, that's going to really start pushing some of these insects. And I don't know, would that help us out? Have to talk to an entomologist about that, I guess.
Yeah, that's such an interesting thought. I think that, we've been kind of, one thing that's worrying, obviously, about the warm temperatures is that we're starting to have things bloom. I'm starting to see red maple here in the Philadelphia area starting to bloom, and the fruit tree people are, of course, nervous about blossoms coming out so early, and then also, being hit by a late frost or a normal timed frost and killing off those flowers. But I hadn't really thought about, besides, us having a mild winter that is maybe not killing off as many pest insects as we would want. What would the effect of a freeze later on be if they've already hatched and they're already out?
Well, you kind of alluded to it. I mean, it affects the plants. Those apple growers, when things go earlier than they should, and then we get that cold snap, then they're at a loss. I don't know. Does that work a little bit with the insects? So
yeah. Oh, very cool thought. I think we're going to have to follow up on that. I've been also thinking about effects that we might see this spring from last summer's drought. And I've been starting to give a couple of talks on conifers and conifer stressors because I got a lot of calls in the fall about what looks to be drought stress on Norway spruce and some other conifers in the landscape that have shallow root systems. And so I'm kind of curious what's going to show up in the spring, a bunch of months after that drought that they all experienced. Starting to get some calls about arborvitae not looking so good in this part of the state, and I'm curious to see what that turns out to be. But this is all part of the fun part of our job, that we get to explore these questions.
Yeah, those are tough ones too. That's that delayed effect, because you kind of have to weed out all the other possibilities. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see what you see.
Yeah, it's an exciting time of year. Well, great, cool. Thanks, Tom. So let's bring on our guest for today, Rick Bates, who is professor of horticulture in the Department of Plant Science at Penn State University. and he's also an extension specialist in ornamental horticulture. So welcome, Rick.
Hi, Margaret. Hey, Tom. Thanks for having me.
Hey, Rick.
Thanks for being on our podcast. This is great. So we like to start off with a pretty basic question. We're wondering if you could describe your role at Penn State.
Sure. I have been here for 22 plus years, and I currently have what's called a three-way split. So I have responsibilities for resident instruction and extension work and research. And so the teaching that I do is primarily in support of the landscape contracting program. I teach a class on tree use and identification and a shrub identification and use class. And then I also teach a class on post-harvest physiology of horticultural crops. My extension work focuses mostly on woody trees, and I work with the Christmas tree industry and the nursery industry quite a bit. So spent a lot of time around the state on Christmas tree farms. And some of my research also gets into that area. Over the last decade or so, we have been involved in a nationwide conifer evaluation program where we're evaluating Mediterranean firs. This would be Trojan fir, Turkish fir, and Nordman fir for Christmas tree use and for landscape use. So that's been a real interesting project. And the second phase of that's starting now and will be going on for the next 5 to 7 years. Then there's also an international component to my job where I have had, and I'm currently working on a USAID project. So I've had 3 USAID projects that have focused on Southeast Asia and strengthening seed systems in that area. And so there we're working on seed systems, post-harvest systems, as well as what we call wild gardening or wild food plants, the use of indigenous plants to improve income, improve diet, and dietary diversity. So I wear several different hats, and that's what keeps the job interesting.
Wow. Yeah. So many different hats. I think so. Our interaction with you, I guess, is through your extension work. I know Tom was saying that he's had you out to teach at some of his pest walks and turf and ornamentals conference that Tom holds at the Penn State Arboretum in the summertime. I'm kind of curious. I'm always curious about the Christmas tree industry because it is kind of it's within the green industry, but it's kind of its own animal, if you will, and is kind of outside the realm of certainly, the work that I usually do and a lot of us green industry educators. But so you're looking at bringing in these new species or cultivars from the Mediterranean. What kind of, I guess, what issues are you hoping to solve for or improve upon for the Christmas tree growers? What are they dealing with that it helps to bring in these new cultivars?
So if you look at the species that Christmas tree growers have used over the decades, particularly here in Pennsylvania, it's a relatively small group of species. Back in the 50s and 60s, for instance, Scotch pine was an important Christmas tree species, and the popularity of that species grew, leveled off, and then began to decline, replaced with Douglas-fir and Fraser fir, which are now the dominant species. And both Douglas-fir and Fraser fir have some pest issues, namely Fraser fir is very susceptible to Phytophthora root rot, and Douglas fir gets a needlecast disease. There are 2 actually. One is called Rhabdocline needlecast, and the other Swiss needlecast. And when all of your eggs are kind of in the Fraser fir, Douglas fir basket, and you're battling with those diseases, it just calls into question the sustainability of that system, and it does cut into profitability as well. And so what really is driving this evaluation project started out to be focused on Phytophthora root rot. Some of these Mediterranean species in the lab, anyway, have shown some very marked resistance to several of the Phytophthora species that we deal with. And that caught the attention of some researchers, and Dr. John Frampton down at North Carolina State University has worked a lot with the Fraser fir industry there, and really started doing some research on this genetic resistance to that prevalent disease. And that's what started the project. And so we've been able to document very high levels of resistance in Trojan fir and Turkish fir and Nordmann fir. And Nordmann fir is fairly common in Europe. As a matter of fact, it's their primary cut Christmas tree species in Europe. They harvest somewhere around 50 million Nordmann fir a year. Turkish fir is closely related to it, and Trojan fir is native to other parts of Turkey. But in that region, there are several of these species that really seem to show promise. And so the Christmas tree industry, with support from state Christmas tree associations in Christmas tree producing areas, as well as the National Christmas Tree Promotion Board, have funded these evaluation projects. And so we're growing these species out in Connecticut, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Michigan, Oregon, and Washington, some of the major Christmas tree growing areas of the country.
So you had mentioned Mediterranean firs that you're evaluating, some of these things you're evaluating, right? So when I think of the Mediterranean, I think of a warmer climate. And is that something you're also looking at in kind of preparation that things might be warming here in Pennsylvania, the growing zones might change in the future? You know, when you think of firs in Western North Carolina, you know, those Fraser firs, those are high elevation, right? That where they're native to. And, you know, you bring them down into Pennsylvania, some of these lower elevations. Is it getting too warm for them?
Yeah, great question, Tom. And the heat that you mentioned is one of the limiting factors in where you can grow a good Fraser fir. You're right, it's a mountain species. It likes high rainfall, high atmospheric humidity. And when our growers here in Pennsylvania and in other areas try to grow it, if you're down in that Philly area, or if you're on like a southwest facing slope, often you have real trouble growing Fraser fir. And that's a problem with some, not all, but some of these Mediterranean species. They definitely have both good drought tolerance and, we think, heat tolerance as well. It depends which of the handful of species that occupy that Mediterranean area that you're talking about. But some, such as Spanish fir and Greek fir, do grow in relatively warm climates. They make excellent landscape species, just because once they get established, they're very drought tolerant. They can take the heat, but they still have really nice foliage characteristics.
Yeah.
Now, for Christmas tree production, if we're looking at something like Turkish fir, these are usually grown in some of the higher elevations in Turkey.
Okay.
And one of the things that that we needed to evaluate is just how far north could we grow Turkish fir without winter damage, because it is growing in a warmer area in these provenances in Turkey. Can you grow this, let's say, in Michigan without getting winter damage? And actually in the trial in Michigan, there was some winter damage because we've reached that northern limit. The Nordmann fir, however, the places where it's indigenous usually is in the high elevation areas of the Caucasus Mountains in the Republic of Georgia. And those places are every bit as cold as some of our northern latitudes here in North America. And that particular species, I think, has better cold hardiness And so, depending on where you might be trying to grow Christmas trees, whether it's maybe the Piedmont of North Carolina, or, some of the higher areas of like Lackawanna County in Pennsylvania, that might determine whether you're trying to grow a Nordman fir or a Turkish fir. They're fairly similar in how they look, but again, where they're native is a little bit different. So we hope that that's the case. The heat tolerance is a little bit harder to study in these evaluation trials. But we're hopeful. We certainly feel like the drought tolerance, we know is there in probably the majority of Christmas tree growers, at least in this mid-Atlantic region. They're not irrigating their trees to get them established. And so we're really relying on rainfall in that year of establishment. And so that drought tolerance is pretty important, especially with the unpredictability of drought, as we go forward.
Yeah, one thing I was just thinking about how Christmas trees are kind of a weird crop because they're growing in a nursery setting, but then the whole purpose of them is to cut them down and bring them indoors, which is obviously probably a very harsh environment for them to persist in. And so I wonder, is a lot of this, or is some of this research also devoted to the post-harvest side of things? And is there a difference between species in how well they do once they're cut and brought into, a dry, hot living room? Or does that mostly have to do with how they're watered and cared for?
It's a combination of those things. That's a good question. The post-harvest piece is really important. If you look at why consumers might switch from a real tree to an artificial tree, the number one reason is what I would call messiness. Usually in the surveys, it's characterized as convenience. But what that means really is how many needles are you vacuuming up after January 1st when you take the tree down, or in some cases the end of January, depending on how long you leave it up, or like me, maybe until March or April. And so the post-harvest is really an important component. That and aroma. If you look at consumer surveys regarding what they like about having a real tree, aroma usually is somewhere near the top there. They like the needles to stay on, but they also like a tree that smells good. And one of the best species for aroma is balsam fir or Fraser fir. But with these new species, these Mediterranean species, that's something that we're also looking at, is once you harvest the tree, bring it indoors, how well does it hold up? And Dr. Gary Chastagner at Washington State University is really the country's leading expert on post-harvest care of Christmas trees. And he has a lab set up. So in these evaluations, each state at the end of fall will harvest branches in our trial plots and send these branches out to Gary at Washington State University, and he'll set them up in his post-harvest lab and monitor things like percent needle drop, how long it takes for them to begin shedding needles, how dry does the tree actually need to become before it really becomes a problem with messiness. And it's really interesting because what we're finding is that these Mediterranean species, the Trojan, Turkish, and Nordman fir, if they're well cared for, they hold up really pretty well in the post-harvest environment. They don't shed a lot of needles. And this gets back to your question about the care component. The big if there is if they're well hydrated, meaning that, they shouldn't be on the retail lot for too long. They need to be hydrated and watered when they're brought in and set up. They ought to have a proper tree stand, that can hold about a gallon of water or so. And when that's the case, these trees do very well. and really hold up as well as the gold standard, which for the West Coast would be noble fir, and for the East Coast would be Fraser fir. Those are two species that have really good post-harvest characteristics. The issue becomes one of shipping these trees longer distances. So prior to Christmas, usually people now begin buying their Christmas trees. The kickoff is around Thanksgiving. It used to be when I was growing up, you'd get a tree a week before Christmas.
Yeah.
So now instead of like 3 weeks on display, we're asking these trees to hold up for 4, 5, even 6 weeks.
Yeah. But
and
if you wait too long anymore, Rick, there won't be anything left. So you're almost forced to buy 4 weeks ahead of time. You don't have an option.
That's right. And so, so when these trees are actually cut in the conditions they're cut under, let's say at the end of October, beginning of November, when these trees are when harvest begins for that wholesale market where these trees are being shipped, that really does affect things. And so we know pretty confidently that these species we're evaluating will be pretty good for like what I would call a local choose and cut market, where people are coming out to the farm. The trees aren't going to be on a lot for too long. They'll rehydrate very well when someone recuts the butt end of the tree and sets it up in their home. So we're pretty confident about that. We need a little bit more research on what happens to these trees when they're cut early, when they're shipped far distances, when they're sitting out on the lot of, let's say, a big box store, and that time from detachment from the root system until display is quite a bit longer. And then there are a lot of things within that value chain that can desiccate the trees as well. So.
Yeah, I'll tell you, I'll pay a little extra for a concolor fir. That's my favorite. But
those are great. Yeah.
Yeah, I like them. Nice look to it, and I think they have a nice scent also. So we got a lot to cover because we really want to get to this international extension work that you do. But I do briefly want to talk about the other component that you mentioned, what your work is consisting of, is teaching these woody ornamental classes. So you've been teaching these now for over 2 decades, and you've seen a number of students that come through. Have you noticed any trends or interests with changing with these students from initially when you started teaching to kind of where you are now? I mean, more questions or interest in natives, or more interest in shrubs versus trees, or any kind of trend that you've noticed with them as they pass through?
So you mentioned, Tom, I've been teaching these classes for 20 plus years now. Is that a nice way to say you're getting old?
No, it's just you're just a wealth of knowledge, like a wise old owl, right?
One of the things that I have noticed, or at least over that period of time, is that applications that the students will use, either computer-based applications or apps on their phones, have gotten much, much better. And so there is, I feel like, an assist from these applications. And so that can be anything from assist in identifying an actual species. So you can pluck off a leaf, take a picture of it on your phone.
Yeah.
Some apps that do, I would say, a relatively good job of ballparking what that species is. So just how IT savvy the students have become is one change.
Is that making them learn it better, or do you think it's hindering them? Are they relying too much on technology to help learn or solve the problem?
Some of the better apps, when we're walking around on campus identifying plants, I'll come up to a species maybe that we haven't covered in class. We'll pull off a leaf, let them use their app and see how good the app does.
Yeah.
Plant. It's about 50%, 50% correct. So, I'm not real comfortable with that, because I really want, it's okay in terms of maybe getting it within the genus, but they need to do better than that. But some of the other, some of the other aspects of that is that, we're looking at these plants when they're in season and then through the fall. And so we don't necessarily get to see these plants, let's say, when they're in flower in spring. And so they can pull these species up on their phone and see that aspect, while we're right out there looking at the plant, let's say in September. And so there are things like that that are useful. The other thing that I think is I've noticed with students now compared to maybe even a decade ago, or certainly 2 decades ago, is that they are much more aware of sustainability in the landscape, and they're aware that the choices that they can make in terms of, let's say, designing a landscape and what woody ornamentals they design into that landscape relate to sustainability. And so we're talking more now about, plants, for instance, that are prone to diseases or insects that might require a higher level of management versus some other species that may be a little bit underutilized, but are certainly more resilient in the landscape. And I think that's a very good trend. So we can walk around on campus, and if we use the example of conifers, we can see hemlock woolly adelgid on hemlock. We can see rhizophyra on Colorado blue spruce, and we can see Rhabdocline on Douglas-fir, white pine decline. They see these problems in these very commonly used species of conifers, but then we can go around the corner or go to another part of canvas and see things like Turkish fir and Nordman fir in the landscape, or oriental spruce, species that don't seem to have as many of these problems right now, and talk about sustainability and building sustainable landscapes based on our species selection. What are the genetics in that species that are going to make that a resilient plant, especially in the face of climate change, where we might have less typical patterns of rainfall, for instance. So that, that's something that I think is much more in the forefront now.
Yeah, that is interesting. We had another podcast guest recently who also does teaching at the undergrad level, and we asked a similar question, and he had mentioned that students seem interested both in sustainability and in utility. So incorporating plants into the landscape that maybe are, they're native, and they're ornamental, but also produce some sort of fruit that can be harvested. Or there was an increased interest in edible landscaping. And we were kind of wondering if the pandemic had something to do with that, with people thinking about utility. And I kind of feel like with conifers, they've been used in the landscape in almost too utilitarian a way. And I think that some people, I think arborvitae is used as a hedge, or to block out your neighbor, or to shield your air conditioning unit, or, it's almost like I really love when people express, interest and just a love of different conifers and what they can sort of add to a landscape, besides just, having them block things or shade, protect things from wind or something like that, because they are kind of used almost like, furniture almost in the landscape. And so
Mention arborvitae in that. Yeah, that's a major food source for deer.
That's what I plant mine for, Rick. I plant mine for deer.
Right. So the hunters out there are certainly interested in keeping our deer fat and sassy over the winter time. That's, it's really an interesting point. One thing that, a couple of points. One is that definitely COVID had an impact on people sticking around home and gardening more and taking care of their landscapes and paying attention to what's going on in their landscapes. Like vegetable seed sales went through the roof. I think generally we're coming to a place now where people are noticing both multi-use plants as well as some plants in the landscape that, you mentioned edible plants. And so there's interest in plants now like pawpaw, and plants that we might call dual purpose plants. There's a lot of interest in indigenous or native edible plants or wild food species. I saw an announcement recently. I think it was for a seminar for ramps, which are type of scallion. It's a native plant in the Appalachians that people will harvest out of the forest and use like onions or scallions. There's a little town in West Virginia that has an annual ramp festival.
Yep.
So I think there is some increased interest in that. And that really focuses on a lot of what my international work in Southeast Asia addresses is using multi-use plants, both as kind of a poverty alleviation tool, as well as ways to diversify diets in those kinds of places.
Yeah, that's a perfect segue into all our questions about your international extension work. And so I'm kind of curious how, obviously that study topic is pretty different from, the first part of our conversation and your extension work here with Christmas tree growers. So I'm kind of curious how that transition happened for you and what made you interested in pursuing work in Southeast Asia with wild plants and seeds and indigenous foodways and things like that.
I kind of backed into it. I have no background in agricultural development and things related to that. But I've always been interested in tropical places. And the opportunity came along to compete for a grant that was offered by the U.S. Agency for International Development. And this particular grant, one of their priority areas had to do with genetic diversity and conserving genetic diversity. And I had a friend that worked at an NGO who was a real plant nerd kind of guy like I am. And we started talking about the erosion of the genetic diversity and what we might propose as a project. And he was working in Thailand at the time. And that's where this work began, basically. This NGO was based in Thailand, and he had really expansive knowledge about a lot of these plants. And so we basically just had the idea of, let's start mapping and characterizing how these plants are used, who are the gatekeepers within these villages in Southeast Asia, and in this case, northern Thailand. Who are the people that are making decisions about propagating them, who hold the knowledge about how to use them. There's this whole area of indigenous knowledge around these plants. And what was interesting is that these plants are in what we call the informal seed system, meaning that you generally can't go to an agricultural supply store and get seeds for them or find them in a nursery. They're just indigenous plants that people have used generation after generation. And they're there. They're threatened because a lot of younger people are leaving these rural areas for the cities or wage labor work in neighboring countries. And so how to manage these plants and knowledge about them is eroding as these younger generations leave the village, because often that information is passed on verbally. It's not written down anywhere. And so that was another component of this first project is, let's identify these plants. Let's see how they're being used. Let's see if the positive impact of some of these species could be magnified or optimized by collecting them and learning more about them. And so the first project, we really started going out pre-dawn in all of these, village produce markets, talking about what the villagers were growing, where they were growing it, then we would go back to their farms and see these systems that, to the unaided eye would look like just a mass of plants, like a jungly arrangement of species. But actually, these very complex systems that were planted with intention, and very, very diverse plants that had multiple uses. They would be used for cash flow in the marketplace. Many of them were extremely high in micronutrients. Some of them could be used for oil production. The seeds had high oil content, so they could be pressed for oil, construction materials, even the use of some species as living fences to restrict livestock. And so it was just a fascinating little project, and we just kind of took that and ran with it. And, now 15 years later, it continues.
So I'm curious when you're, oh, sorry, Tom.
No, go ahead, Margaret. Go ahead.
When you're, and I wonder this about a lot of international extension, a big part of our work is connecting with growers and earning trust, in the communities where we're working as extension educators. And so I wonder, and that can take a long time, even in, where we live here, to establish trust and be able to learn from one another. And I imagine that is kind of amplified when you're overseas and interfacing with different cultures. And I'm sure there's a language barrier there. So what was your experience with working in these communities, and how did you sort of establish the trust that you needed to learn from them and to do the work that you sort of came to do?
Well, in a way, I kind of staffed my weakness in that, I certainly hadn't worked there previously, but we relied on some really excellent collaborators. Several NGOs. One is called ECHO, based in Fort Myers, Florida, but they had a resource center in Chiang Mai, Thailand. There was another NGO called the Upland Holistic Development Center, and several others. And in that part of the world, there is extension work done, but it's often these NGOs that are doing it. It usually is not university based. Mm-hmm. And so these NGOs had long standing experience working with some of these communities. And so we were able to kind of plug into that system, which saved a lot of time and a lot of effort, and really relied on that local expertise to essentially gain access to, a lot of the key stakeholders that had this knowledge, had access to some of the things that we needed to do the research. So we had a graduate student who would essentially go into various villages and live there for a month at a time, kind of doing inventories of these species and characterizing how they were used. So we really needed a lot of cooperation at the local level, and these NGOs provided that. And so interesting that extension, even in underdeveloped countries like that, where there is still a lot of poverty in rural areas, and a lot less infrastructure, extension is really still important, and the basics of extension still apply there. Where people go to get their information, how farmers learn from each other, and some of the basic tenets of extension in a developed country, you can still see that at play in some of these places where we've worked.
So when I was communicating with you about appearing on this podcast, you were talking about a couple things, and one of them was grafting. And here in the United States, grafting is often done for some root disease issues, or in vegetables at least, or to produce a faster growing plant. What are the reasons over there that you're doing grafting? Very similar, or some different things going on?
That's a great question, Tom. The main reason has to do with disease control. Okay. And so one of our projects focused on grafting market demanded tomato cultivars onto eggplant rootstock. And one of the reasons to do that is because, for instance, this project we were working on was in Cambodia. And during the rainy season, actually year round, Cambodia imports about 70% of the vegetables that are consumed in the country. And one particularly difficult time of year is during the rainy season, where it literally does rain every day. And so you're dealing with very saturated soils, and tomato production just about ceases because of soil-borne diseases. But at the same time, eggplant is much more tolerant, to waterlogged soils, much more resistant to some of the soil-borne diseases that they struggle with when they're trying to grow tomatoes. And so one of our projects was to evaluate a number of different disease-resistant lines of eggplant, including some local ones that villagers would use just to grow eggplant, and then grafting tomatoes on these and growing them during the rainy season in very saturated soils. And the results were just excellent. It really opened up some possibilities in terms of supplying tomatoes to local markets, as well as household nutrition and diversifying household diets. And so we were really very successful in doing this. And so one of the interesting things was we tested a number of eggplant rootstocks. We obtained the germplasm from the World Vegetable Center in Taiwan, as well as some of the local eggplants that you find growing wild. And some of the wild eggplants there in these villages where we were working may produce, an eggplant the size of your thumbnail, but were just big, tough plants that were 2 or 3 years old, but we could still use them as rootstocks. And all of these World Vegetable Center rootstocks, as well as the local ones, were open pollinated, meaning that we could also train the farmers on how to save seed, collect, save seed, store seed for the next growing season. So they basically wouldn't have to purchase the seed for the rootstock. They basically could just grow that and keep that resource there, on their own homestead or in the village. And so then they could select what market demanded varieties they want and grow their own eggplant rootstock. And then we focused on using a number of different NGOs and some governmental agencies as well to do a lot of training on how to graft. And, especially the older women in these villages took to it really well. They were used to sewing, to, using
nimble hands,
nimble fingers to, and were really turned out to be excellent grafting. And so we focused on using local resources. I think it was quite successful using, local materials to make things like healing chambers and things that you would need that would be fairly low tech, but worked. And so it was really an effort to get around some of those disease pressures of the rainy season. We started looking at tomato grafted onto eggplant, but you could also graft sweet peppers onto hot peppers. And there's, some other things that could be done. But that's one that worked really well. It's really now been scaled up. We collaborated with the National University of Battambang in the north of Cambodia and their horticulture program to really scale up this grafting technology. And so it's now pretty much being done commercially in certain areas of Cambodia. So that was, we feel like that was a success story.
Yeah, big impact.
Absolutely. Wow. That is really cool to hear about, and that it's been a long-lasting project, and to hear kind of how you landed there is so interesting, and very cool that you were able to kind of learn a new skill set, I guess, or explore a different part of horticulture than you originally set out to do. And so I think at this point, we're kind of wrapping up here with our conversation, Rick. We really thank you so much for coming on the podcast. And we always like to end the episode by asking our guests a personal question about themselves. And so when you're not working in horticulture and for the university, what do you like to do with your time?
Good question. I'm a walker, a hiker. And so when I'm here local in central Pennsylvania, a number of times a week, I'm out on the game lands. So here in Center County, we have a game lands 176 called Scotia by the locals. And so I'm always back there, hiking. I have a son who also lives out in Montana who has a small ranch out there. And I spent about 6 years out in the Bozeman area. And so I go back there every summer and like to hike in the wilderness areas out there. And we usually climb a mountain or two, nothing technical. But climbing and hiking is what I'm passionate about.
Oh, wonderful. Montana must be beautiful.
Certain times of the year it is.
Oh, that's great. It's cool to learn that about you. Well, thank you again for being a guest on our podcast here. We've really enjoyed talking to you, Rick, and look forward to working with you more in the future.
It's been fun, Margaret. Tom, thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. All right. Take care.